Brian and Wayne Robeson dedicate this episode to their grandfather, H. Foster Nichols. More on that later. August 31st, 1945. They have been opposed to each other for a decade, and both actively opposed to the Japanese for most of that time. Each of them now believes that he and his armies are the true leaders of China. Each of them controls large parts of Chinese territory, and each of them has public or private backing from Josef Stalin. So this week, Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong meets with Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-Shek. The world is watching. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Soviet Union's invasion of Manchuria ended with an overwhelming Soviet victory. Japanese Emperor Hirohito broadcast the Japanese surrender already back on the 15th, though, but it's taking time for the war to physically end, and the actual surrender has yet to be formally signed. But if the World War is ending, there is revolution in Vietnam and trouble brewing for a possible civil war in China. The plan is for the official instrument of Japan's surrender to be signed 2 days from now. But there's a lot going on. On the 27th, Allied fleets anchor in Tokyo Bay, getting ready for that big day. That same day, the Japanese surrender Burma in Rangoon. Frederick Browning, Chief of Staff for Allied Southeast Asia Command, does the signing for the Allies, and Takatsu Numata, Chief of Staff for Japanese Southern Army, for the Japanese. Cecil Harcourt arrives with ships of the British Royal Navy, including carriers Indomitable and Venerable, at Hong Kong the 29th, preparing to accept its surrender. Britain very much wants to have Hong Kong back in its orbit, which is not exactly in the interests of the Chinese. There is some drama when an air patrol from Indomitable spots what seems to be kamikaze speedboats leaving Lama Island and heading for the fleet, but they destroy the lead ships and the others disperse. However, discussions among everyone involved about the terms of the actual surrender mean that though Hong Kong is handed over to the British the 30th, formal surrender is not to be signed until after the formal surrender of Japan to China is signed. So, not yet. On the 31st, Douglas MacArthur takes over the American occupation government in Tokyo. You know what? Until this week, not a single Allied soldier has actually set foot on the Japanese home islands except POWs. Colonel Charles Tench, one of MacArthur's staff, is the first on the 28th, landing with a task force of 150 men at Atsugi Airfield near Yokohama, and stepping out of his C-47 Dakota at 8:28 a.m. The occupation of Japan has begun. On August 30th, General MacArthur arrived in Japan in an extraordinary scene which alarmed many of the Americans who were with him. As MacArthur drove the 15 miles from Atsugi Airport to Yokohama, more than 30,000 Japanese soldiers lined both sides of the road with bayonets fixed. On the 31st, the Marcus Island garrison surrenders to the Americans. As for Manchuria, well, on the way to victory, the Soviets took territory the size of France, Germany, and Poland combined in just 2 weeks. Here is a nice analysis of the whole operation. The Soviet offensive was a model application of overwhelming force and rapid mechanized exploitation. The Red Army achieved operational and tactical surprise, and the breakthrough of the fortified zone by the 1st Far Eastern Front, and the sweeping, unopposed advance by the tanks of the 6th Guards Tank Army fatally compromised the Kwantung Army's defensive plan in a matter of days. Soviet tanks and SPGs led advances over mountains, swamps, and forests thought impassable by the Japanese. Army, Corps, and division commanders demonstrated initiative and creativity, having tanks clear roads through forested hills, closely integrating operations with riverine forces, flying fuel to resupply units, and even placing tanks on captured rail cars to secure key objectives as the Japanese defenses collapsed. Japanese units could still fight fanatically, inflicting 32,000 casualties on the attackers, holding out in fortifications such as Huto to the death, and launching repeated suicide attacks against Soviet attacks. The Soviets expertly organized their force according to terrain and mission. Rodion Malinovsky's Trans-Baikal Front had an army-level tank and mech force with loads of extra trucks and things, since they had to cover such huge distances. The tanks even got fuel supplied by plane, as I just said. The units that had to deal with heavy fortifications, like those in the 1st Far Eastern Front, had extra engineers and extra artillery. The Japanese had only limited armor, too, so the main functions of the Soviet armor were exploitation and infantry support. Also, the two Japanese tank brigades were in reserve in the Central Plains, so they were never engaged by the Soviets, who took 369 tanks after the surrender. The Japanese did have one tank regiment that actively engaged the Soviets in the Kurils, and it lost 20 tanks to Soviet anti-tank weaponry. The question on many people's lips at the moment is, will the Soviets turn over Manchuria to the Chinese? And if so, when? Back on the 14th, Soviet leader Josef Stalin signed a treaty with Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-Shek, a provision of which is the return of Manchuria. I mentioned last week that Stalin cabled Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong and told him to go meet with Chiang. Well, this week on the 27th, U.S. Ambassador to China Patrick Hurley flies from Chongqing to Yan'an and then escorts Mao back to the temporary capital of his enemy. Side note here, this is Mao's first ever trip by plane, and before boarding, he kisses his wife. Apparently, he has never kissed her in public before and never will again. In Chongqing, there is a welcome banquet that evening, and Chiang says he hopes for the atmosphere of 1924. 1924 was during the First United Front, when Mao organized for the Kuomintang, and Zhao Enlai, Mao's head of security, was Chiang's chief political officer at the Whampoa Military Academy. Happy times. There was a mood of optimism in the air. American journalists had reported on the shift in communist propaganda since the Sino-Soviet treaty was signed. The CCP's newspapers were calling Chiang president, rather than the leader of a reactionary clique. The Central News Agency cited well-informed observers to the effect that a comprehensive settlement between the two parties was inevitable. Both leaders played the roles assigned to them. Chiang, the perfect host, Mao, the respectful guest, referring to Chiang as President Chiang Kai-Shek and pledging his support. He raised a glass of Mao Tai and proclaimed 10,000 years to President Chiang. It was the toast normally given to China's emperors. They will be meeting for at least 4 or 5 weeks of negotiations. I mentioned a couple weeks ago the directive that the Japanese could only surrender to the KMT, the nationalists, and not the communists. This, of course, was for Chiang's forces to try and maintain control of things in the parts of the country where they didn't have much force, and the communists have a lot. The Japanese did this, becoming allies of the government they had been trying to annihilate for 8 years. For weeks, the Japanese fought off communist attempts to disarm them, and they patrolled the all-important rail lines of North China. While this use of the Japanese divisions was a necessary expedient, it was also a sign of weakness on the part of the central government, an indication of its lack of preparedness. The facts on the ground indicate an almost absurd anomaly, that the group authorized to take the Japanese surrender had no capacity to do so, while the group that had the capacity was denied the authority. But one thing that one absolutely must consider: the 1.5 million Soviet troops now in Manchuria, bordering the regions where the communists are strongest. This might well make impossible a China that is both united and friendly to the United States. I'm going to actually quote Richard Bernstein yet again about this. With the end of the war, the situation was drastically and irretrievably different. And the biggest difference was that the Chinese communists were dominant in North China, and there was virtually nothing that could be done short of a massive effort by the United States on the scale of the recently concluded war to dislodge them. Mao's communists do not feel abandoned by the Soviets because of that treaty with Chiang. Rather, they are emboldened by the Soviet occupation of 3 North Chinese provinces. They need the U.S. less than ever, and they and the Soviets are undeniably playing for the same team. Mao gets word that his troops have arrived in Dalian from Chefu in Shandong province, which they took the 23rd. And the Soviets tell those troops they're not going to interfere in any of their activities on the village level, and they are even allowed to have unarmed mass organizations in the large cities. There is an American death in Shandong province this week. On the 25th, Captain John Birch, heading a 4-man American Special Services team in China, is killed by Chinese Communist forces. In the U.S., there are those who will call him the first casualty in the Third World War between communists and the ever-shrinking free world. He is the first American killed by communist forces in Asia, whether or not there are ever more such deaths. Birch is an Army Air Forces officer working for the OSS, the U.S. Intelligence Agency, and the U.S. War Department has called him outstanding. He was already in China 2 years before Pearl Harbor and is extremely anti-Japanese. He has specifically been working for the team that collects info for Claire Chennault's 14th Air Force. And with the Japanese surrender, he's been sent to Shandong province to scout local airfields that might be used by 14th Air Force when getting American POWs out from nearby Japanese prison camps. Shandong province is important for its two main ports on the peninsula that juts into the Yellow Sea, Chefoo in the north and Qingdao in the south. They command the maritime approaches to Manchuria. Well, Birch is here to meet Hao Pengju for help. Hao had been a nationalist commander, but became a garrison commander for Japan's Nanjing puppet regime in East China. Here's where it gets tricky and illustrates the overall complexity of things. Chiang Kai-Shek wants the garrison incorporated into his nationalist army, but the communists have close contacts with some of the commanders in Hao's divisions and want him to go over to them. They for sure do not want any American interference. Birch and his crew, which also includes 7 Chinese and 2 Koreans, are stopped by communist forces when they arrive. Birch says he doesn't care about KMT, CCP, power politics, and just wants to scout the airfields. They let him go, but he is stopped a second and then a third time. Now they want to disarm his party. He refuses, things escalate, and Birch is shot in the leg and then bayoneted to death. This is the first of several such incidents, spoiler, where American presence in Shandong is opposed at gunpoint. The Chinese communists are very much consolidating south of and within Manchuria. Other communists are consolidating power this week a few thousand kilometers to the southwest, in Vietnam. On the 25th, Viet Minh leader, communist leader, Ho Chi Minh, partly because of his strong stand against the French colonial masters, manages to persuade Emperor Bao Dai to abdicate, giving the Viet Minh power and giving Ho some real legitimacy with the general population. He plans to set up a new government in Hanoi. On the 26th, he heads a meeting of the Communist Party of Vietnam, and they decide they will proclaim independence and have a meeting in Hanoi of a provisional revolutionary government to present a declaration to the general public. On the 30th, Ho invites several people, including OSS personnel, to contribute ideas for his Vietnamese Declaration of Independence. Back to Bao Dai's abdication. He composed the abdication edict the 22nd, and it is officially announced the 25th as the week begins. He's received several demands to abdicate the last couple weeks, though, and apparently has tried to get in contact with Harry Truman, Charles de Gaulle, King George VI, and Chiang Kai-Shek, but to no avail. A small French military force tries to prevent his abdication, but they are captured by the Viet Minh. Bao also calls on the imperial family to support the Viet Minh, and it is pretty clear that all of this is voluntary by Bao, not under any coercion. So the August Revolution is proclaimed a success, and Ho Chi Minh and company return to Hanoi. More on this soon, for this week is over. A week of worry and wonder about Manchuria, with Chiang meeting Mao and Stalin somewhere in the background. Ho Chi Minh putting together a declaration of independence in Vietnam, ever more Japanese garrisons surrendering to the Allies or heading in that direction, and an Allied fleet in Tokyo Bay because Japan's complete surrender is to be formally signed in 2 days. If that happens, then this war, for all of the aftershocks in Manchuria, Indonesia, and Vietnam, and anywhere else, this war will be over. It's really hard to believe, but it's true. 2 days from now, I will be here with another regular episode to cover that surrender. I trust you will all be here with me for that. As I mentioned earlier, Brian and Wayne Robeson wanted to dedicate this episode to their grandfather, H. Foster Nichols. Foster joined the U.S. Navy shortly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. Because he already had bookkeeping and accounting experience, he qualified as storekeeper in early 1942 with the rank of petty officer. For his first assignment, Foster went to Washington, D.C. to deal with the aftermath of the attack. As he explained, I was taken to a desk that was piled about 3 feet high with file folders containing the records of naval personnel who were killed in Pearl Harbor. Here it was the middle of August, 8 months later, and payment of wages owed and death benefits due had not been paid to their next of kin. It was my job to determine who was to be paid and to process the necessary documents so that such payments could be made. Soon there was a new problem to deal with. See, when a ship went down, it also took up to 3 months' worth of pay records with it. Foster's next job was to try and fill in the blanks. At the time I was assigned to the unit, we had about 82 ships that were lost. It was our job to research the last records available and try to determine the pay due each person who had been lost or killed. There must have been 15 or 20 Navy men in this unit, and we had more work than we could do. Our naval losses at the first stage of the war were devastating. Foster was discharged from the Navy in 1946. Almost 70 years later, he returned to Pearl Harbor with his daughter in 2014. A 93-year-old Foster sat inside the memorial and looked over the names of those who had lost their lives in 1941. He quietly commented, "These are all my boys." See you next time.